Chapter 8. 2 more golden tickets found. That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announced the finding of not only the 3rd golden ticket, but the 4th as well. 2 golden tickets found today, screamed the headlines. Only 1 more left. All right, said Grandpa Joe when the whole family was gathered in the old people's room after supper. Let's hear who found them. The 3rd ticket, read Mr. Bucket, holding the newspaper up close to his face because his eyes were bad and he couldn't afford glasses. The 3rd ticket was found by Miss Violet Beauregard. There was great excitement in the Beauregard household when our reporter arrived to interview the lucky young lady. Cameras were clicking and flashbulbs were flashing and people were pushing and jostling and trying to get a bit closer to the famous girl. The famous girl was standing on a chair in the living room, waving the golden ticket madly at arm's length as though she were flagging a taxi. She was talking very fast and very loudly to everyone, but it was not easy to hear all that she said because she was chewing so ferociously upon a piece of gum at the same time. I'm a gum chewer normally, she shouted, but when I heard about these ticket things of Mr. Wonka's, I gave up gum and started on chocolate bars in the hope of striking lucky. Now, of course, I'm back on the gum. I just adore gum. I can't do without it. I munch it all day long except for a few minutes at mealtimes when I take it out and stick it behind my ear for safekeeping. To tell you the truth, I simply wouldn't feel comfortable if I didn't have that little wedge of gum to chew on every moment of the day. I really wouldn't. My mother says it's not ladylike and it looks ugly to see a girl's jaw going up and down like mine do all the time, but I don't agree. And who's she to criticise anyway? Because if you ask me, I say her jaws are going up and down almost as much as mine are, just from yelling at me every minute of the day. Now, Violet, Mrs. Beauregard said from the far corner of the room where she was standing on the piano to avoid being trampled by the mob. All right, Mother, keep your hair on, Miss Beauregard shouted. And now, she went on, turning to the reporters again, it may interest you to know that this piece of gum I'm chewing right at this moment is one I've been working on for over 3 months solid. That's a record. That is, it's beaten the record held by my best friend, Miss Cornelia Prinzelmeisel. And she was furious. It's my most treasured possession now, this piece of gum is. At night time, I just stick it on the end of the bedpost and it's as good as ever in the mornings. A bit hard at first, maybe, but it soon softens up again after I've given it a good few chews. Before I started chewing for the world record, I used to change my piece of gum once a day. I used to do it in our lift on the way home from school. Why the lift? Because I like sticking the gooey piece that I've just finished on one of the control buttons. Then the next person who comes along and presses the button got my gum on the end of his or her finger. What a racket they kick up, some of them. You get the best results with women who have expensive gloves on. Oh yes, I'm thrilled to be going to Mr. Wonka's factory. I understand that afterwards he's going to give me enough gum to last me for the rest of my whole life. Whoopee! Beastly girl, said Grandma Josephine. Despicable, said Grandma Georgina. She'll come to a sticky end one day, chewing all that gum. You'll see if she doesn't. And who got the 4th golden ticket? Charlie asked. Now let me see, said Mr. Bucket, peering at the newspaper again. Ah, yes, here we are. The 4th golden ticket, he read, was found by a boy called Mike TV. Another bad lot, I'll be bound, muttered Grandma Josephine. Don't interrupt, Grandma, said Mrs. Bucket. The TV household, said Mr. Bucket, going on with his reading, was crammed like all the others with excited visitors when our reporter arrived. But young Mike TV, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed by the whole business. Can't you fools see I'm watching television? He said angrily. I wished you wouldn't interrupt. The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television set with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which one bunch of gangsters was shooting up another bunch of gangsters with machine guns. Mike TV himself had no less than 18 toy pistols of various sizes hanging from belts around his body, and every now and again he would leap up into the air and fire off half a dozen rounds from one or another of these weapons. Quiet, he shouted when someone tried to ask him a question. Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? This show's an absolute whiz-banger. It's terrific. I watch it every day. I watch all of them every day, even the rotten ones where there's no shooting. I like the gangsters best. They're terrific, those gangsters. Especially when they start pumping each other full of lead or flashing the old stilettos or giving each other the 1, 2, 3 with their knuckle dusters. Gosh, what I wouldn't give to be doing that myself. It's the life, I tell you. It's terrific. That's quite enough, snapped Grandma Josephine. I can't bear to listen to it. Nor me, said Grandma Georgina. Do all children behave like this nowadays? like these brats we've been hearing about? Of course not, said Mr. Bucket, smiling at the old lady in the bed. Some do, of course. In fact, quite a lot of them do, but not all. And now there's only one ticket left, said Grandpa George. Quite so, sniffed Grandma Georgina. And just as sure as I'll be having cabbage soup for supper tomorrow, that ticket will go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it. Chapter 9. Grandpa Joe Takes a Gamble. The next day, when Charlie came home from school and went in to see his grandparents, he found that only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other three were all snoring loudly. Shh, whispered Grandpa Joe, and he beckoned Charlie to come closer. Charlie tiptoed over and stood beside the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and then he started rummaging under his pillow with one hand. And when the pillow came out again, there was an ancient leather purse clutched in the fingers. Under cover of the bedclothes, the old man opened the purse and tipped it upside down. Out fell a single silver sixpence. It's my secret hoard, he whispered. The others don't know I've got it. And now you and I are going to have one more fling at finding that last ticket. How about it, eh? But you'll have to help me. Are you sure you want to spend your money on that, Grandpa? Charlie whispered. Of course I'm sure, spluttered the old man excitedly. Don't stand there arguing. I'm as keen as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money and run down the street to the nearest shop and buy the first Wonka bar you see and bring it straight back to me and we'll open it up together. Charlie took the little silver coin and slipped quickly out of the room. In 5 minutes, he was back. Have you got it? Whispered Grandpa Joe, his eyes shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held out the bar of chocolate. Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise, it said on the wrapper. Good, the old man whispered, sitting up in the bed and rubbing his hands. Now come over here and sit close to me and we'll open it together. Are you ready? Yes, Charlie said, I'm ready. All right, you tear off the first bit. No, said Charlie, you paid for it. You do it all. The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the wrapper. We don't have a hope, really, he whispered, giggling a bit. You do know we don't have a hope, don't you? Yes, Charlie said, I know that. They looked at each other and both started giggling nervously. Mind you, said Grandpa Joe, there's just a tiny chance that there might be one. Don't you agree? Yes, Charlie said, of course. Why don't you open it, Grandpa? All in good time, my boy, all in good time. Which end do you think we ought to open first? That corner, the one furthest from you. Just tear off a tiny bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything. Like that, said the old man. Yes, now a little bit more. You finish it, said Grandpa Joe. I'm too nervous. No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself. Very well, then. Here goes. He tore off the wrapper. They both stared at what lay underneath. It was a bar of chocolate. Nothing more. All at once they both saw the funny side of the whole thing, and they burst into peals of laughter. What on earth is going on? Cried Grandma Josephine, waking up suddenly. Nothing, said Grandpa Joe. You go on back to sleep. Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting slowly down of an icy sky that was the colour of steel. By evening it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping, and oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and each time he stepped outside the door the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape from them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something very cold weather gives one an enormous appetite. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realise, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on, he became ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of chocolate, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then, all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everybody in the house began to starve, and every day little Charlie Bucket trudged through the snow on his way to school, and he would have to pass Mr. Wonka's chocolate factory. Every day, as he came near to it, he would lift his small pointed high nose in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep, swallowing breaths, as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the icy blanket one morning, "that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us, we're too old to bother with. But a growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can one do?" murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over the cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so as to save his strength. In the mornings he left the house 10 minutes earlier so he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during break, resting himself while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then, one afternoon, walking home in the icy wind, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by something silvery lying in the gutter in the snow. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. A 50-pence piece. Quickly he looked about him. Had somebody just dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way it was buried in the snow. Several people went hurrying past him on the pavement, their chins sunk deep in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of a small boy crouching in the gutter. Then, was it his? This 50-piece? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole 50-pence! He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment. Only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery shop, the kind that sells almost everything, including sweets and cigars. And what he would do, he whispered quickly to himself. He would buy one luscious bar of chocolate and eat it all up, every bit of it, right there and then. And the rest of the money he would take straight back home and give to his mother. And that is the end of chapter 10. So, 5 bullet points about what we've read. We've read a lot. What can you remember? You might want to go back and have another listen. 5 bullet points. Enjoy, and we will start writing later in the week. See you soon.